with a wonderful emoji at the end of it. I suppose we're looking at it from pregnancy through to the age of 5, so through to children starting school.
A subtle but seismic shift is rippling through the corridors of Kensington and Buckingham Palace, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, quietly expands her portfolio and takes on a more central role in high-level royal engagements. The Queen's closest allies are growing visibly anxious. The once clear hierarchy of influence is blurring, and insiders report that those loyal to Camilla are scrambling to protect their standing as the public's focus turns increasingly toward the future of the monarchy. The Invisible Expansion. The official diary for the coming autumn was released 3 days ago. It sits on a heavy mahogany desk in the private study of the Queen's chief advisor. He has spent the entire morning using a red pen to mark the engagements. He is not looking at the King's schedule. He is looking at the schedule of the Princess of Wales. Catherine has secured 6 major overseas diplomatic tours in the next 8 months. That is 2 more than the Queen. For years, the royal calendar was a predictable machine. The Queen held the primary international portfolio. She represented the crown at the most significant Commonwealth summits and cultural openings. Catherine was meant to focus on domestic issues, specifically early childhood development and mental health. The division was clear. It kept the spheres of influence separate and stable. That stability has now completely evaporated. The change did not happen in one big televised moment. It happened in the quiet, day-to-day shifting of priorities. Last month, Catherine led the delegation to the Environmental Summit in Geneva. It was a role traditionally reserved for the Queen. Catherine did not just attend the sessions. She held private, one-on-one meetings with 3 heads of state. She did it without a single member of the Queen's team present. The Queen's allies noticed the absence of their staff immediately. They began to track the staffing assignments for every one of Catherine's trips. They discovered a pattern. Catherine is now hiring her own independent team of diplomats and policy experts. She is no longer pulling resources from the shared royal pool. She is building a private, high-powered administrative unit that answers only to her. This is a massive shift in how the royal household operates. This expansion is being called a stealth takeover by the Queen's inner circle. They feel that Catherine is effectively building a shadow court within the larger institution. They argue that this move bypasses the established chain of command. They believe it is a strategic effort to cement Catherine's own authority before the public. They are not accusing her of breaking rules. They are accusing her of creating a new set of rules that favor her future reign. The tension reached a breaking point during a recent planning meeting at Buckingham Palace. A senior aide to the Queen questioned why Catherine's team had not submitted their travel itinerary for the upcoming winter tour. The response from Catherine's private secretary was short. He stated that the itinerary had been approved directly by the King. The Queen's aide had no answer to that. The King had bypassed the usual oversight. He had given Catherine direct access. This is the mystery that now consumes the staff at the palace. Why is the King so eager to accelerate Catherine's rise? Some think he is simply planning for the long term, ensuring that the monarchy remains relevant for the next generation. Others believe he is tired of the internal frictions within his own household. By shifting the focus to Catherine, he may be trying to minimize the influence of the various competing factions that have made his life difficult over the last year. Catherine's expansion is not just about travel, it is about influence. She has recently been tasked with overseeing the legacy audit for the entire royal estate. This is a massive project that reviews how the monarchy will be presented to the world for the next 20 years. Whoever controls this audit controls the narrative of the future. The Queen's allies know this. They see their influence being squeezed out of the very rooms where the future is being written. The atmosphere in the palace has become noticeably colder. The 2 camps, those loyal to the Queen and those aligned with Catherine, rarely speak outside of the formal requirements. There is a sense of waiting. Everyone knows that the expansion of Catherine's role is not going to slow down. It is only going to accelerate. The Queen's allies are doing the math. They see a future where their access to the levers of power is significantly reduced. The concrete reality is simple. Catherine is taking on more work. She is doing it with higher-level support, and she is doing it by building her own structures. This is not a hobby, it is an institution-building project. The Queen's inner circle is now on the defensive. They are no longer the ones shaping the future. They are the ones watching it happen from the sidelines. The invisible expansion has become a very visible reality for those whose power depends on the old way of doing things. The changing perception. The morning press briefing at Buckingham Palace had become a ritual of scrutiny. A press officer stood before a corkboard, pinning up the front pages of the national newspapers. For months, the Queen's team had counted on the Camilla effect, the steady, reliable coverage of her charitable work. But today, the board told a different story. In 6 out of 7 papers, the lead photograph was not of the Queen at her recent hospital visit. It was of the Princess of Wales during her tour of the North. The public's appetite had shifted. They were no longer just curious about Catherine. They were looking to her for leadership. The headlines were filled with phrases like, "the future of the firm," and "stepping into the light." The readers were responding to a version of royalty that felt energetic, modern, and highly visible. It was a stark contrast to the traditional, cautious pacing that had defined the Queen's approach for the last year. This was not a result of a marketing campaign. It was a reaction to Catherine's presence. Her return to full-time duties following her health recovery had been greeted with a level of public warmth that was, to put it mildly, intense. When she appeared at the Order of the Garter service, the crowd's response was deafening. It was the kind of genuine, unfiltered enthusiasm that royal advisors spend entire careers trying to manufacture. The Queen's team felt the sting of it every time they checked the social media metrics. The Queen's closest allies began to hold emergency strategy meetings. They were desperate to recenter the Queen's own projects in the media cycle. They pushed for more press releases. They tried to highlight the Queen's work on literacy and domestic safety. But the traction just wasn't there. The public was focused on the Wales brand, and no amount of controlled messaging could redirect that attention back to the current monarch's consort. One advisor suggested that the Queen should undertake a series of solo, high-impact visits to key Commonwealth nations. He argued that it would remind the public of her elder stateswoman status. The suggestion was met with silence. They all knew the reality. A solo tour by the Queen would only invite direct comparisons to Catherine's own recent, highly successful tours. It would be a battle they were likely to lose in the court of public opinion. The mystery that began to circulate was whether this shift was intentional or organic. Was Catherine's team carefully cultivating this public obsession? Or were they just surfing a wave they couldn't control? The Queen's allies suspected the former. They claimed that Catherine's private secretary was behind the Wales brand expansion. They painted him as a master strategist who knew exactly how to capture the public's imagination, while appearing to do nothing more than his duty. This perception created a deep sense of vulnerability within Camilla's camp. They felt that their work was being slowly rendered invisible. They were no longer the main attraction, they were the supporting cast. The transition of the public's focus to Catherine wasn't just a trend. It was a fundamental realignment of how the British people viewed their future leaders. The Queen's allies were terrified that if the shift continued, their influence would be completely eclipsed before the next coronation ever took place. The tension manifested in small, petty ways. There were reports of requests for media access being accidentally delayed for the Queen's team, while Catherine's office seemed to receive instant confirmations. There were whispers about who leaked what to the press. The atmosphere at the palace had moved from professional rivalry to genuine, cold-blooded defensive maneuvering. They were no longer working together to support the king. They were working to survive the changing tide. The public didn't see any of this. They saw a united family. They saw the Princess of Wales performing her duties with grace and the Queen continuing her own vital work. But inside the palace, the perception gap was wide enough to drive a wedge through the household. Catherine's growing popularity was the reality that defined every decision. For those loyal to the Queen, it was an existential threat. They were watching the future arrive, and they were realizing with mounting dread that they had no place in it. The defensive wall. The Queen's long-term aides gathered in a cramped office in the East Wing on Monday morning. They were looking at a spreadsheet of the upcoming media cycle. It was mostly blank where the Queen's name should have been. For years, these aides had built a rhythm of success based on controlled, intimate events. Now, they were trying to force that same rhythm onto a media landscape that had completely moved on. They were working twice as hard to get half the result. They decided to launch a new initiative focused on the Queen's work with literacy programs. They called it the Silent Impact. The plan was simple. They would release a series of short, documentary-style videos featuring the Queen in unexpected settings. It was a classic humanizing tactic. They wanted to remind the public of the Queen's quiet, steady dedication. They believed that once the public saw this personal side, the focus would naturally drift back to her. The problem was the timing. Every time they were ready to launch a video, a major update regarding Catherine's international tour schedule appeared in the press. The media, always hungry for the biggest headline, ignored the literacy campaign in favor of the next diplomatic milestone. The Queen's aides tried to adjust their release times, even moving them to early hours of the morning, but it was useless. The momentum of the future-proofing narrative was too heavy to stop. The efforts were soon branded as desperate by the younger courtiers in the palace. This was not a critique of the Queen's work, but of the strategy. The palace operates on a sense of inevitability. When a courtier acts like they are chasing attention, they lose their standing. By constantly trying to force the media to look at the Queen, her aides were signaling that they were no longer the ones setting the agenda. They looked like people reacting to a storm rather than guiding the ship. This was the mystery that confounded the Queen's team. Why did their professional, carefully curated content feel so alien to the current media environment? They were doing everything right. They were following the playbook that had worked for decades. They could not understand why the public was no longer buying what they were selling. They interpreted the lack of response as a failure of the press, not a shift in the culture. The tension became palpable during a meeting with the head of the Royal Communications Department. One of the Queen's aides demanded to know why their literacy campaign had not been given top-tier placement on the official social media hub. The response was a cold recitation of the new engagement algorithms. The data showed that the public was clicking on the Princess of Wales's content at a rate of 4-to-1. The aide had no rebuttal. The math was not on their side. They redoubled their efforts. They started drafting opinion pieces for the national newspapers. They tried to place the Queen on morning television shows. Every move felt louder than the last. It was a defensive wall built of press releases and media appearances. But a wall does not project confidence. It projects fear. They were trying to build a perimeter around the Queen's relevance, but the world was already looking past them. The Queen did not participate in these strategies. She performed her duties as she always had, with a quiet, stoic grace. She seemed to understand, in a way her staff did not, that you cannot fight a narrative shift with a press release. The desperation was entirely on the side of her people. They were fighting for their own relevance, not just hers. They knew that if the Queen's projects were not the main event, then their own positions within the palace were increasingly redundant. The wall was cracking. Every attempt to re-center the Queen only made the gap between her and Catherine more obvious. The media began to treat the literacy campaign as a response to Catherine's popularity, rather than an initiative on its own merit. It was a trap of their own making. The harder they pushed, the more they proved that they were playing a game of catch-up. The defensive wall had become a cage, and the public was watching it from the outside, losing interest in what was happening within. The clashing calendars. The crisis began on a Tuesday in early June. It started with a simple notification on the shared digital diary used by the senior households. The Queen's office had scheduled a high-profile visit to a major urban regeneration project in Manchester for the 14th of the month. It was intended to be the cornerstone of her summer outreach. Less than 1 hour later, an update appeared for the same date. The Princess of Wales had been booked for the launch of a climate initiative in the same city. The scheduling conflict was not an accident. It was a collision. In the past, the King's private secretary would have acted as the referee. He would have adjusted the timings or moved one of the events to a different week. But this time, the correction never came. Both offices insisted that their respective engagement was non-negotiable and critical to the national interest. The impasse forced the King to personally intervene. He ultimately asked the Queen to postpone her trip by 48 hours. This decision was a humiliation for the Queen's team. It was not just about the date, it was about the hierarchy of importance. By choosing to keep Catherine's engagement in its original slot, the King had signaled that the Princess of Wales's priorities were now the priority of the monarchy. The Queen's staff viewed this as a deliberate slight. They saw it as the moment the King finally sided with the next generation over the current Queen's own agenda. The friction deepened when the details of the respective visits were leaked to the press. Catherine's team had secured primetime coverage for her climate launch. The Queen's rescheduled event, however, had to be moved to a smaller, less media-friendly location due to logistical constraints. The comparison was brutal. One engagement felt like a vibrant, forward-looking mission. The other felt like a quiet secondary duty. The press did not miss the difference. The Queen's allies began to complain about the lack of communication from the King's private office. They claimed they were being kept in the dark about Catherine's movements until the very last minute. They felt like they were playing a game where the rules changed every morning. They started to view every meeting with the King as a potential ambush. They were constantly looking for signs that their influence was being further curtailed. This was the mystery that defined the following week. Why was the King allowing this level of visible competition between the two households? Some insiders suggested he was trying to encourage a healthy rivalry to keep everyone working at their best. Others argued he was simply overwhelmed by the conflicting demands of his wife and his daughter-in-law. Whatever the reason, the result was a toxic environment where every calendar entry became a battleground for status and attention. The courtiers in Catherine's office were, for their part, playing a very careful game. They never spoke ill of the Queen. They remained perfectly professional in every correspondence. But they were also very firm. They refused to budge on any of their scheduled engagements. They acted with the quiet confidence of people who knew they had the King's full backing. This only added to the frustration of the Queen's team, who felt like they were being outmaneuvered by a group that wasn't even fighting them. The tension eventually reached the ears of the public. Whispers about palace divisions began to surface in the gossip columns. It was a nightmare for the King's communications team. They had worked hard to present an image of a unified, stable monarchy. Now, they were facing reports of a Cold War between the two most prominent royal women. The calendar clash had transformed a private scheduling error into a public narrative of decline and division. The Queen's allies knew they had to find a way to regain their footing, but the options were disappearing. Every time they tried to assert their authority, they found themselves blocked by the simple, immovable fact of Catherine's rising popularity. The clashing calendars were just the symptom of a much deeper reality. The monarchy was moving into a new season, and for the Queen's camp, the shift in the seasons felt like an ending. The future-proofing narrative. The official announcement came on a Wednesday morning. It was a formal press release from the King's private secretary. The document laid out a new initiative titled The Long View. It outlined a plan for the next 10 years of royal engagements. The central goal was future-proofing the institution. It prioritized the expansion of the Princess of Wales's role in diplomatic and cultural outreach. The language was sterile and bureaucratic, but the implications were immediate and clear. Catherine's staff had drafted much of this policy. They framed it as a necessary step for the monarchy to remain relevant in a changing world. They argued that the public expected a younger, more active leadership. They pointed to the rising engagement numbers of the younger generation. They used data to justify why Catherine's work had to take precedence. It was a clinical, objective argument for why the old guard had to step back. The Queen's allies were stunned. They had been kept out of the drafting process. When they finally saw the document, they realized that future-proofing was a polite term for their own obsolescence. The document did not explicitly say the Queen's role was diminishing. It just focused entirely on the growth of Catherine's portfolio. It was a masterclass in professional exclusion. The Queen's team could not complain, because doing so would make them look like they were against the future of the crown. This created a deep sense of panic among the senior courtiers who had served Camilla for years. They understood the narrative. They knew that once a policy like the long view was in place, it would be almost impossible to reverse. They tried to frame their own projects as essential to stability, but the wind had shifted. The palace was no longer interested in stability. It was interested in momentum. They were now the anchor, not the sail. The mystery was how Catherine's team had managed to secure such a strong mandate from the King. They had moved with extreme caution, building their influence in small, incremental steps. They had never once overreached. They had waited for the perfect moment to present their vision of the future. The King had been the target of this process for months. He had finally been convinced that the transition needed to be formalized. The Queen's supporters began to look for ways to counter the narrative. They tried to organize a series of historical reflection events to remind the public of the Queen's long record of service. But the events were poorly attended and received little press coverage. The public was looking forward, not backward. The future-proofing narrative had taken hold, and it had a power that the Queen's allies could not match. The tension peaked during a private dinner at Sandringham. a senior advisor to the Queen, made a comment about the risks of moving too fast. He warned that losing the connection to the past would damage the institution. The room went cold. Catherine's private secretary responded by asking if they should be planning for the next decade or the last one. It was a sharp, clinical observation that silenced the table. It was the moment the Queen's team realized they were losing the ideological war. The reality was simple. The institution was evolving. Catherine was the face of that evolution. The Queen's allies were being left behind by a narrative they helped create. They had spent their careers focusing on the Queen, but they had ignored the way the world was changing around them. Now, that change was dictating their own future. They had to adapt or watch their influence vanish completely. The Queen herself remained above the fray. She continued her duties with her usual composure, but her inner circle was fraying at the edges. They were no longer a unified team. Some began to look for ways to transition into Catherine's orbit. Others retreated into a quiet, resentful isolation. The long view had not just changed the monarchy, it had broken the coalition of support that had defined Camilla's reign. The future had finally arrived. The King's balancing act. The King stood in the center of his private study. He was looking at a set of photographs on his desk. One showed the Queen at a regional food bank. The other showed Catherine at a major international trade summit. Both women were doing excellent work. Both were vital to the monarchy. But they were occupying different spaces in the national consciousness. He felt the weight of both roles pressing down on him. He had spent his morning meeting with two separate teams. The Queen's team wanted more public recognition for her charity work. They felt she was being unfairly sidelined. Catherine's team wanted more support for her growing diplomatic portfolio. They felt she was hitting a ceiling that needed to be broken. He had promised both sides that he was listening, but he knew he could not give both sides what they wanted. This was the core of his struggle. If he prioritized the Queen, he risked stalling the modernization of the monarchy. If he prioritized Catherine, he risked undermining the standing of his wife. He had spent his entire life watching his mother navigate these exact kinds of pressures. He knew that the stability of the institution depended on the balance. But the balance was not static. It was changing under his feet. He decided to hold a private lunch. He invited both women to Windsor Castle. It was a rare, informal meeting. He wanted them to talk through their schedules and find a way to work together. He hoped that a direct conversation would clear the air. He wanted them to see that they were on the same side. The reality, however, was much more complicated than he had anticipated. The conversation at lunch was polite. It was perfectly cordial, but it was also very guarded. Catherine spoke about her desire to expand her work to reach a wider audience. The Queen responded by talking about the importance of deep, long-term commitment to local causes. Both were right. Both were committed to the service of the crown, but they were talking past each other. They were two different leaders with two different visions for the future. The King realized that he could not mediate this conflict through logic alone. It was not a disagreement over strategy. It was a fundamental difference in direction. He realized that the Queen felt her reign was being cut short by the success of the Princess of Wales. She saw the expansion of Catherine's role as a personal erasure. Catherine, meanwhile, saw her work as the necessary next step for the survival of the institution. Neither was wrong. Both were trapped. The mystery was what the King would do next. He had to show support for his wife. He had to encourage his daughter-in-law. He did both. He made sure to mention the Queen's recent success in his next public address. He also publicly praised Catherine's initiative during his visit to the Welsh Assembly. He was trying to keep the two ships sailing in the same direction, but the water was getting rough. His advisors warned him that this balancing act could not last forever. They told him that eventually he would have to make a choice. He would have to decide which vision would lead the monarchy into the next decade. He did not want to make that choice. He wanted to hold on to the status quo for as long as possible. But the pressure from the Queen's inner circle was not letting up. They were demanding more access, more resources, and more public spotlight. The King returned to his desk at the end of the day. He picked up the photograph of the Queen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the photograph of Catherine. He put them both back in the drawer. He was a king who understood the value of history and the necessity of the future. But he was also a man who was caught in the middle. He knew the conflict was only going to escalate, and he knew that he was the only one who could manage it. The unspoken tension. The garden party at Buckingham Palace was designed to be a display of flawless unity. Thousands of guests moved across the manicured lawns. Tea was served under white tents. The Queen and the Princess of Wales stood together in the receiving line. They wore matching shades of pale blue. They smiled for the cameras. They shook hands with dignitaries. To the thousands watching from behind the velvet ropes, everything appeared perfectly orchestrated. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was vastly different. A senior courtier observed the two women from the steps of the terrace. He noted that they had not exchanged a single personal word for over 40 minutes. When they did speak, it was only to coordinate the next movement in the receiving line. There was no laughter. There was no casual leaning in. It was a professional performance of proximity that felt entirely devoid of warmth. The Queen's chief advisor stood near the same terrace. He was watching Catherine's staff. He noted how they were constantly scanning the crowd, directing the press toward Catherine every time the two women drifted apart. He counted the number of times Catherine was approached by high-profile guests compared to the Queen. The count was heavily skewed in the Princess of Wales's favor. He did not say a word, but his jaw remained clenched. This was the new reality of the joint appearance. Every smile and every nod was being measured. The public saw a unified front. The insiders saw two separate teams fighting for the same piece of ground. The tension was not about policy or projects anymore. It had become personal. The Queen's team felt they were being erased from the institution they had served for years. Catherine's team felt they were simply doing the work that the public demanded. The mystery that began to spread among the guests was why the interaction felt so rigid. Even the most casual observers noticed the lack of chemistry. One journalist leaned over to a fellow reporter and commented on the glass wall between the two women. The comment was picked up by nearby microphones. It was a small moment, but it captured the feeling of the entire afternoon. The public was starting to see past the polished pale blue veneer. The Queen's team attempted to mitigate the optics by scheduling a surprise appearance for the Queen at a nearby community shelter later that evening. It was a classic move. It was meant to show the Queen in a more authentic, hands-on environment. But the strategy backfired. The news coverage focused entirely on the contrast between the morning's stiff palace display and the evening's quiet, individual work. It made the Queen look like she was struggling to find her place. Catherine's team did not respond to the move. They did not need to. They simply continued with their planned itinerary, which included a visit to a prestigious university research center. The contrast in the types of events was stark. The Queen was doing a traditional service. Catherine was doing modern, intellectual engagement. The divide was widening. The future-proofing narrative was becoming the dominant framework for how the world understood its roles. The day ended with a quiet, private debrief at Clarence's house. The Queen's senior advisors met to discuss the optics of the event. They were frustrated. They felt that no matter what they did, the narrative kept sliding away from them. One advisor suggested that they stop trying to compete. He argued that the Queen should simply do her work and let the press draw its own conclusions. It was a desperate realization of defeat. The tension remained unresolved. The unspoken rivalry continued to define the daily operations of the household. Every event, every photograph, and every schedule was now a test of influence. The Queen's team was exhausted. They were fighting a war they were never designed to win. They were professionals of the old guard, and they were facing the irresistible momentum of the new. The garden party had been meant to show unity, but it had only highlighted the distance between the two women. The Cold War had reached the lawn.